The hyperspace tunnel collapsed with a sound that shouldn't have existed, a screaming silence that bent the fabric of reality itself. Stanley Ipkiss felt the wooden mask vibrate against his face as his small starship, borrowed, technically stolen, but he'd been meaning to return it, tore through dimensions like a fist through paper. Behind him, the rift sealed itself with a flash of impossible colors that hadn't been invented yet. When consciousness returned, Stanley was upside down in Tatooine's red desert sand, his ship a smoking crater beside him, and the mask still plastered to his face like an unwelcome roommate who'd just seen him at his worst. He'd been trying to contact the mask's previous owner for the past 3 weeks. This wasn't how he'd imagined that conversation going. Well, Stanley said aloud, his voice emerging from somewhere between his mouth and the mask's ancient wood, amplified by dimensions that were still figuring out the rules of physics. New galaxy, same face, could be worse. He stood up. The gravity was lighter than Earth's. He went up about 15 feet before remembering that gravity still applied to other people. Stanley had never been good with the rules part of reality. The mask, however, was excellent at ignoring them. The twin suns of Tatooine hung in the sky like cosmic eggs, casting everything in shades of orange and red that would have looked amazing in a Warner Brothers cartoon. Stanley took a moment to appreciate the alien landscape, squinted at the distant mountains, and noticed a city carved into the sand about 2 miles away, Mos Eisley, according to the vague sense of common knowledge that the mask seemed to download directly into his skull whenever he needed it. Right, Stanley said, straightening his suit, still perfectly pressed despite the crash, because the mask maintained its own aesthetic standards. Let's go make some friends. He started walking, leaving human-shaped footprints in the sand that filled themselves in behind him, as if he'd never touched the ground at all. Above, TIE fighters screamed across the sky in perfect formation, something Stanley's Earth-trained brain recognized as military hardware, but which his masked consciousness simply categorized as toys we could probably turn into something hilarious. The spaceport at Mos Eisley was chaos. Beautiful, wonderful chaos. Exactly the kind of place where a green-faced man with a wooden mask on wouldn't immediately stand out as the weirdest thing in the room. Humanoids rubbed shoulders with reptilians. Droids argued with organic beings about parking fees. Somewhere someone was selling meat that Stanley was pretty sure wasn't meat. He walked into the Mos Eisley Cantina like he owned it, which was the mask's favorite way to enter any room. The band, a Cantina band, very literal naming convention, hit a sour note and stopped playing. Every head in the establishment turned toward him. Some heads were singular, some heads numbered in the plural. One wasn't technically a head at all. Gentlemen, ladies, and assorted life forms, Stanley announced, his green face breaking into a grin that seemed to contain more teeth than a single face should possess. Name Stanley Ipkiss. I appear to have crashed in your galaxy. Anybody got a drink that doesn't explode? The silence held for exactly 3 seconds before a Rhodian in the corner started laughing. That laugh spread like a contagion through the bar, laughter that transcended species barriers, because humor, apparently, was the one truly universal language. Even the droids chirped what could only be described as mechanical amusement. Within an hour, Stanley had become a legend. He'd started with simple tricks, pulling a drink out of thin air and it actually appearing, real liquid and everything. Then he'd made his face stretch like taffy to retrieve a dropped credit chip from under a Wookiee's table. By the time he produced an entire band from inside his jacket, they played briefly before poofing back into non-existence. The entire bar was convinced they'd either met a god or someone very, very high on spice. "You're not from around here," a human woman said. She was smart-eyed, wore rebel insignia on her vest, and looked like the kind of person who'd actually believe his story. Not from this sector, not from anywhere near here. Different galaxy entirely, Stanley confirmed, pulling a chair backward and sitting in it like a normal human being who understood furniture. Mine had different rules, Earth rules, much less exciting, fewer Wookiees. "What are you?" she asked, not unkindly. "Honestly," Stanley gestured to his face. "Your guess is as good as mine. I've got this mask." He reached up and touched the wooden surface. "And when I wear it, reality, and I have different opinions about how things should work, the mask usually wins." The woman's expression shifted from curiosity to calculation. "You've got power, actual power, not force-based, not technology, something else. Is that a problem?" Stanley asked. "I'm not really the problem-making type. I'm more of a problem-solving type, or problem-creating while trying to solve it type. Depends on your perspective." "It might be," she said quietly. "There are people who hunt power. The Empire hunts power, and there are others." She paused, listening to something in her ear communicator. Her face went pale. "TIE fighters, 3 of them, heading this way. They're scanning for something strange." Stanley looked out the Cantina's window. Sure enough, 3 Imperial fighters cut through the Tatooine sky, moving with the kind of purposeful military precision that suggested someone had reported something very unusual happening in a small spaceport. The mask hummed against his face, a vibration of anticipation that felt almost like laughter. "Well," Stanley said, standing up and straightening his suit again, even though it hadn't moved. "I've been in this galaxy for about 40 minutes. That's probably a record for how long it takes to attract attention." The rebel woman grabbed his arm. "We can hide you. There's a transport leaving in." "Nah," Stanley said, and his grin widened into something that broke normal physical laws about how wide a grin could get. "I think I want to see what happens when Imperial TIE fighters meet a guy who doesn't understand the concept of impossible." He walked out of the Cantina into the Tatooine sun, leaving behind a room full of beings who weren't entirely sure what they'd just experienced. One thing was certain: the galaxy had just gotten infinitely more unpredictable. The TIE fighters descended, the mask vibrated, and Stanley Ipkiss, green-faced and grinning, prepared to meet the military might of the Galactic Empire with nothing but cartoon logic and confidence. The TIE fighters screamed down from the Tatooine sky in perfect formation, their Imperial engines making that distinctive whine that meant business. Stanley stood in the middle of Mos Eisley's main thoroughfare, watching them descend with the kind of casual interest most people reserved for watching paint dry. The mask had a different perspective on incoming military hardware. "They're going to try to stun me first," Stanley muttered to himself, his green face tilted upward. "Standard protocol for unknown threats. Probably. I mean, I've seen enough sci-fi movies to know how this usually goes." The problem was that Stanley's movie knowledge and actual military doctrine didn't always align. What he did know, with absolute certainty, was that the mask had never met a weapon it couldn't turn into something ridiculous. The first shot came from the lead TIE fighter, a blue stun bolt that screamed through the air with lethal intent. Stanley watched it approach with the temporal awareness the mask granted him. Time didn't slow down exactly. Instead, the universe seemed to speed up around him, and Stanley moved at a pace that looked impossibly casual, but was actually perfectly synchronized with incoming fire. He caught the stun bolt with his hand, like it was a baseball. The bolt didn't explode against his palm or deflect wildly. Instead, it simply stopped existing, its energy absorbed into the mask like the universe had hit an undo button. Stanley looked at his palm, marveled at the tingling sensation, and immediately did what the mask suggested. He grabbed the air with his other hand and pulled. An entire TIE fighter manifested in the space between him and the real TIE fighters, except this one was made of solidified cartoon logic. It spun lazily in midair, cartoon style, with exaggerated proportions and a bemused face painted on its viewport that somehow conveyed the exact expression of a confused Imperial pilot. "Mine now," Stanley announced to the real TIE fighters, which had banked hard to avoid hitting their fabricated twin. "Finders keepers, that's a rule everywhere, right?" The lead pilot made a decision that would echo through Imperial intelligence reports for months. They opened fire with everything they had. What followed was the most thoroughly impossible firefight that Tatooine's desert had ever witnessed. Stanley didn't run. Running was for people who followed physics. Instead, he began to move with a fluidity that made lightsaber combat look rigid by comparison. Stun bolts became harmless streaks of light that he waved away like annoying insects. Laser fire turned into ribbons that he wove into increasingly complex patterns. One bolt he caught spun around his finger like a circus performer with a flaming baton and hurled back at the shooter, except it had somehow transformed into a flower that bloomed on impact with a shower of soft petals. The rebel woman from the Cantina watched from the doorway, her hand on her blaster, completely uncertain whether to help or flee. Around her, other residents of Mos Eisley had come outside to watch the spectacle. Word was spreading through the spaceport with the speed of hyperspace communication. There was something impossibly green and impossibly confident causing trouble near the main square. One of the TI pilots made a critical error. They aimed for the crowd, trying to force Stanley into a position where he'd have to choose between defending civilians or accepting a hit. It was solid military strategy. It assumed Stanley operated within conventional parameters. Stanley didn't. Instead of diving toward the crowd, he simply reached into the space beside him and pulled out a massive umbrella, 10 feet across, covered in paisley patterns, utterly ridiculous. He held it above the crowd like it weighed nothing, which, for the mask's purposes, it didn't, and the stun bolts that reached it simply bounced harmlessly away, dissipating into the Tatooine air. "Folks, I'd recommend you all stay calm," Stanley called out, not even looking away from the sky. "This is basically a Tuesday for me. Well, a Tuesday on a different planet in a different galaxy, but the principle's the same." The second TIE fighter tried to gain altitude. Stanley didn't let it. He reached up with both hands and simply grabbed the sky. Not literally, because the sky wasn't something you could grab, but the mask had opinions about what constituted literal and what constituted metaphorical, and in its reality-warping perspective, grabbing the sky and pulling was a perfectly viable tactical option. The TIE fighter found itself wrapped in an invisible force that had nothing to do with the Force. It wasn't the dark side or the light side, it was the cartoon side, and it followed rules that the Star Wars galaxy had never encountered before. The pilot lost all control, his fighter spinning like a toy dropped by a distracted child. Stanley was kind enough to set it down gently outside the city limits. A tumbling crash, sure, but the pilot would probably survive. Probably. The mask's definition of mercy was flexible. The third TIE fighter's pilot made the smartest decision. They ran. Their engine screamed as they pushed throttle beyond safe parameters, fleeing back toward the Star Destroyer that had presumably sent them. The two remaining fighters, one fake and made of impossible logic, one very real and very confused, watched them go. Stanley turned back to the crowd, his green face split by a grin that seemed to contain the entire humor of the universe compressed into one impossible smile. "So," he said cheerfully, "anyone know where I can find some decent food? I'm starving, and I just realized I don't actually know what currency works here." The rebel woman stepped forward, and Stanley could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was reassessing him, not as a threat, not exactly, but as a variable that didn't fit into any existing equation. "You just defeated 3 Imperial TIE fighters," she said slowly, "without a weapon, without a ship, without anything but apparently confidence and whatever that is." She gestured at his face. "It's a mask," Stanley said helpfully. "Loki's mask, technically. God of chaos and mischief. I didn't really understand the theological implications when I first put it on. I still don't, to be honest. Things just sort of work." "The Empire will send more," the woman said. "If you defeated their scouts this easily, they'll escalate. They'll send inquisitors. Maybe worse." "Will they, though?" Stanley asked, genuinely curious. He looked at his hands, flexed them experimentally. "Or will they have to figure out how to fight someone who doesn't follow their rules? Someone whose weapons are bad jokes and impossible physics? Someone who makes Jedi look like they've got everything figured out?" "You've never met a Jedi," the woman said. "Not yet," Stanley agreed. "But give it time. I have a feeling this galaxy and I are about to become very well acquainted." He pulled a coin from his pocket. It materialized there, which was how the mask operated, and flipped it. It caught the Tatooine sunlight and seemed to multiply, dozens of coins spinning through the air before all but one vanished. "Heads," Stanley said as it landed. "I stay. Tails, I find another galaxy. Call it." The woman didn't call it. She just watched the coin settle into his palm and nodded slowly. "My name's Kara," she said. "I work with people who oppose the Empire. If you're staying, and if they're going to keep sending soldiers after you, then maybe we should talk about what you want to do with all that power." "That," Stanley said, "is the most Star Wars conversation I've had since I arrived. Are we standing on a landing platform next? Should there be dramatic wind effects? Maybe some ominous music?" Despite everything, Kara smiled. "You're insane." "Probably," Stanley agreed. "But I'm insane in a way that just defeated 3 TIE fighters with a cartoon umbrella. In this galaxy, that might actually count as an asset." Behind them, the fake TIE fighter was slowly fading away, its impossible logic unable to sustain itself in regular reality. The real pilot's friends were already broadcasting reports up the chain of command. Grand Moff Tarkin was going to hear about this. The Jedi, whoever they were probably going to feel something in the Force. And somewhere in the depths of space, Lord Vader would sense a disturbance that couldn't be explained by conventional Force sensitivity. The galaxy had no idea what was about to hit it. The message reached Grand Moff Tarkin's office aboard the Star Destroyer Executor within 2 hours. By Imperial standards, that was remarkably fast, a testament to how thoroughly confused the surviving TIE pilots were when they filed their reports. Tarkin read the datapad once, then read it again, his weathered face remaining expressionless throughout. A single pilot had defeated 3 starfighters. Not defeated, obliterated their ability to fight using methods that defied sensor analysis. The weapon signatures didn't match anything in the Imperial database. The defensive capabilities suggested neither Jedi nor dark side Force sensitivity. And most troubling of all, the destruction had been conducted with what witnesses described as impossible humor. That last phrase appeared in 3 separate reports. Tarkin didn't know what it meant, and he hated not knowing things. "Send for Inquisitor Vex," he commanded, setting down the data pad. His aide moved immediately. Tarkin was many things, ruthless, efficient, brilliantly strategic, but he was also practical. 3 TIE fighters suggested a threat. The impossible defeat of those fighters suggested something that required higher-level intervention. The Inquisitor arrived within the hour, which meant she'd been close, waiting for deployment. Vex was pale-skinned, red-haired, and yet carried herself with the casual confidence of someone who'd killed thousands and felt no regret about any of them. She was also one of the few Force users Tarkin had personally recruited into the Imperial hierarchy, a testament to her exceptional abilities. "We have an anomaly," Tarkin said, sliding the datapad across his desk. "On Tatooine. Mos Eisley Spaceport." Vex read the reports with the speed of Imperial training, her eyes scanning 3 pages in the time it took Tarkin to take a breath. When she looked up, there was curiosity in her expression, and for someone trained to suppress emotion in favor of dark side efficiency, curiosity was worth noting. "This is filtered through multiple witness accounts," Vex said. "The descriptions are contradictory. One witness says the threat wielded a weapon made of green light and intention. Another says it was a being who bent the air. A third describes it as someone who made physics negotiate." "Do you sense anything through the Force?" Tarkin asked. "Nothing," Vex said. "Which is itself interesting. If this were Jedi, I'd sense it. If it were dark side, I'd sense it. This reads as a blind spot. Something the Force can't quite grasp. Can it be killed?" Vex smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "Everything can be killed, Grand Moff. The question is method. Whatever this is, it's not operating within conventional parameters. Conventional weapons might be ineffective. But I can feel something in the Force. A kind of wrongness, like someone introduced chaos into a carefully ordered equation." Tarkin nodded slowly. He'd built his reputation on bringing order to chaos. The Death Star itself was a monument to imposing Imperial will on the galaxy. Something that fundamentally rejected conventional parameters was, by definition, a threat to that order. "Take a strike team," he commanded. "Investigate, capture if possible, eliminate if necessary. But Inquisitor, be cautious. Something that defeated 3 TIE fighters without conventional weapons deserves respect, if not mercy." Vex stood, her crimson lightsaber already calling to her through the Force. "Understood, Grand Moff. I'll report back once I've assessed the threat level." She left, and Tarkin returned to his administrative tasks, but part of his mind remained on Tatooine. In his experience, anomalies that defied classification were the most dangerous kind. They couldn't be predicted. They couldn't be countered with standard doctrine. They had to be understood, and understanding required investigation, which meant exposure, which meant risk. He made a decision and sent a second message, this one much higher up the chain of command. On Tatooine, Stanley was eating the worst food he'd ever experienced and genuinely enjoying himself. It was some kind of meat, he was fairly certain, served with vegetables that tasted like they'd been preserved in regret and then reconstituted in disappointment. The cantina was different from the first one, smaller, more working class. Kara had brought him to a place where rebel sympathizers congregated, where questions weren't asked and money wasn't examined too closely. "So let me get this straight," Stanley said, gesturing with his fork. "The Empire controls most of the galaxy. They're led by a guy called the Emperor, very on-the-nose branding. They want order, control, the whole authoritarian package. And you're fighting them because that's generally bad?" "That's the simplified version," Kara said. She was watching him with fascination, trying to determine if he was genuinely naive or putting on an act. "The complicated version involves senators getting murdered, entire planets getting destroyed, and a system of government that makes dissent a capital offense." "Yeah, okay, that sounds bad," Stanley admitted. He took another bite of the questionable meat. "And there are these Jedi people, Force users, right? Like they can move things with their minds?" "Were," Kara corrected. "Most of them were killed. There was a purge about 15 years ago. If any survived, they're hiding." Stanley processed this information while the mask hummed quietly against his face, downloading context that he couldn't quite grasp, but which felt important. The Jedi were peacekeepers who'd been systematically eliminated. That suggested someone very powerful had decided they were a threat. That suggested politics at the galactic scale, the kind of thing that made individual agency meaningless. Except Stanley wasn't particularly bound by meaninglessness. "Okay," he said, setting down his fork. "New question. What's the most important thing I could do to help you? Not something flashy or impressive, but actually useful." Kara leaned back, considering. "Information. We need to know what the Empire's planning. We know they're working on something massive. A space station, possibly. Rumors suggest it can destroy planets. If we could confirm that, get proof, then what? Then we could tell the galaxy, show people what they're really fighting against." Stanley nodded. He understood the logic. Information as a weapon was elegant in a way that fit his palate. Messy, complicated, but ultimately funny, because it exposed the contradiction between what people wanted others to believe and what was actually true. "I can do that," he said. "But I need to know something first. If I help you, if I get involved in your rebellion, what happens when the Empire decides I'm a priority target?" "They already have," Kara said quietly. "That's what the TIE fighters were. Scouts. By now they've reported back. By now, the Empire knows something unusual happened on Tatooine. By now, they're making decisions about how to respond." The mask vibrated against Stanley's face, and he felt the peculiar sensation that meant something important was about to happen. It was the same feeling he got before a punchline landed perfectly, before a moment of slapstick comedy resolved into beautiful chaos. The mask understood the beat of story, the rhythm of escalation. "How long until they send real soldiers?" Stanley asked. "Hours, maybe less." "And where's the nearest Imperial facility where they might have information about this space station thing?" Kara's eyes widened. "You can't seriously be thinking—" "Of course I am," Stanley said, standing up and straightening his suit. The mask had already decided what needed to happen next. "I just got here. I defeated 3 TIE fighters basically by accident. The Empire's going to send increasingly powerful people to stop me until they either kill me or figure out I'm not killable. Seems like while that's happening, I might as well make myself useful." He pulled a data pad from thin air. It materialized with the casual disregard for physics that the mask specialized in, and handed it to Kara. "That's a schematic. Not sure where it came from. The mask just sort of knows things now. It's a Star Destroyer-class vessel heading to Tatooine from the main Imperial fleet. It'll be here in approximately—" He paused, consulting information that seemed to exist in the space between his ears and reality. 6 hours. "What do you intend to do?" Kara asked, her voice very carefully neutral. "Get aboard," Stanley said. "Find this space station information. Get back out before anyone realizes I was there. Or, if the mask has other opinions about how this should go, we'll improvise. That's basically my standard operating procedure anyway." "You'll be walking into a military vessel full of trained soldiers." "Exactly," Stanley said, grinning. "Which is perfect, because I've got a wooden mask that makes physics irrelevant and an absolutely terrible sense of risk assessment. It's a match made in whatever counts as heaven in the Star Wars universe." Kara looked at this impossible green man, this being who'd materialized from another galaxy entirely and was now casually planning to infiltrate Imperial military hardware, and realized she was watching the moment everything changed. The rebellion had been fighting a losing war for years. They needed something unconventional. They needed someone who didn't play by any rules the Empire understood. They needed Stanley Ipkiss. "I'll get you to the docking bay," she said. "There's a maintenance shuttle that can get you close. But Stanley, if this goes wrong—" "It won't," Stanley said with absolute confidence. "Or it will, but in a funny way. The mask has never really distinguished between successful chaos and chaotic success. Either way, we win. Outside, the twin suns of Tatooine were beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Far above, a star destroyer cut through the stars, carrying soldiers who had no idea what was coming. The mask vibrated with anticipation. The Star Destroyer Resolute cut through space with the inevitability of Imperial doctrine made manifest. It was a massive wedge of Imperial power, over a mile long, bristling with weapons, carrying enough firepower to slag a continent. On its bridge, Captain Nevin coordinated the approach to Tatooine with the precision of someone who'd performed this maneuver 100 times before. Routine. Everything about this mission was routine. That was about to change. Inquisitor Vex stood in the observation lounge, watching Tatooine grow larger against the stars. She could feel something in the Force. Not a disturbance exactly, but an absence. A blind spot. The kind of thing that made the Force whisper warnings in a language she didn't quite understand. In her training under the Emperor's hand, she'd learned that such whispers usually meant opportunity. The dark side thrived in chaos and confusion. Inquisitor, a subordinate approached. We're receiving a priority transmission from the docking bay. They're reporting an unidentified shuttle approaching. No transponder code, no clearance signal. Vex turned from the viewport, her hand instinctively drifting toward her lightsaber. An unidentified shuttle approaching a Star Destroyer during a military operation was either a profound security failure or the beginning of something far more interesting. Bring it aboard, she commanded. Prepare a reception committee. Full armed escort. Stanley had never been inside a Star Destroyer before, but he had the strong sense that he was doing it wrong. He'd come aboard using what he could only describe as cartoon smuggling logic, manifesting inside a storage compartment that definitely shouldn't have had a person in it, then simply walking out into the corridor as if he owned the place. The mask had assured him this would work, and the mask had so far been right about basically everything. The corridors were exactly what Stanley expected, sterile white, filled with Imperial efficiency, populated by stormtroopers who all moved with identical military precision. It was like walking through a video game level where everyone had been programmed with the same set of behaviors. "Excuse me, soldier," Stanley said to the first stormtrooper he encountered, affecting a tone of absolute authority. "I'm looking for the records section. Officer business." The stormtrooper stopped walking. There was a pause. Stanley could almost hear the gears turning inside the helmet, comparing the green-faced man in an impeccable suit to the database of expected personnel. It came back empty, which created a decision tree that stormtrooper training didn't quite cover. "Sir, I don't have authorization for a civilian to," the stormtrooper began. "Not a civilian," Stanley interrupted, pulling a badge from thin air that materialized with such convincing Imperial aesthetic that it probably violated several Federation regulations. "Commander Ipkiss, Special Operations. I need those records, and I need them now." The mask had a gift for authority. It was the confidence of someone who'd never experienced the concept of no, projected through a green wooden face, with the charisma of a cartoon character meeting real-world bureaucracy. The stormtrooper, confronted with apparent rank, apparent credentials, and an attitude that suggested questioning would result in paperwork, made the path of least resistance. "Record section is 3 corridors forward, left at the junction, detention block marked." "Got it," Stanley said, already moving. "Carry on, soldier. Don't bother reporting this encounter. We're operating on a need-to-know basis, and frankly, you don't need to know." He was 3 corridors away before the stormtrooper's brain finished processing what had just happened. The record section was less guarded than Stanley expected. It appeared the Empire, for all its efficiency, still operated under the assumption that the interior of a Star Destroyer was inherently secure. A handful of technicians worked at data terminals, processing information, updating files. They barely glanced at Stanley as he walked past them toward the central terminal. The mask knew exactly what to look for. It was like having a search function built into his consciousness. He moved through the Imperial database with the fluidity of someone who'd trained for this, except Stanley had never trained for anything in his life. The mask, however, had the accumulated knowledge of an artifact that had existed for millennia and had opinions about how databases should be organized. There, personnel rotation files, engineering manifests, and deep in the encrypted section that required multiple security clearances to access, Project Starkiller. Stanley's green fingers flew across the keyboard, downloading information that materialized onto a data chip that definitely hadn't been in his pocket a moment ago. Schematics for a space station. No, not a space station. A weapon, a planet killer. Something so monumentally devastating that its mere existence was meant to be kept classified at the highest levels. Interesting, Stanley muttered. The mask was humming now, vibrating against his face with that particular frequency that meant things were about to get complicated. So the Empire's building a doomsday weapon. Very on brand. Very evil. Very... You're not supposed to be here. Stanley froze. The voice came from behind him, cool and controlled, speaking with the particular confidence of someone trained to kill. He turned slowly, finding Inquisitor Vex standing in the doorway, her crimson lightsaber already activated, casting the records section in shades of red and shadow. "Well," Stanley said, his green face breaking into a grin. "That's a statement that covers a lot of ground. I'm not supposed to be in this galaxy, not supposed to be on this ship, and definitely not supposed to be standing in the records section stealing classified information. But here we are." Vex's eyes narrowed. She was scanning him with more than just sight. Stanley could feel the force moving around him, trying to grasp him, trying to understand him, and finding only smooth surfaces that couldn't quite be penetrated. To a force user, he probably felt like looking at the world through frosted glass. "What are you?" she demanded. "Depends on who's asking," Stanley said. He was moving casually toward the exit, not running, not threatening, just moving with the confidence of someone who'd never learned to be afraid. "But the short answer is, I'm someone who crashed into your galaxy about 6 hours ago and is having a significantly more interesting time than I expected. You defeated 3 TIE fighters." "They were pointing weapons at me," Stanley said. "Seemed rude." I returned the sentiment in a more creative fashion. Vex moved with the speed of someone trained by the Force, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her lightsaber came down in a strike that would have bisected a normal person, would have bisected most Force users. But Stanley wasn't bound by the limitations of being a normal person or a normal Force user. He caught the lightsaber. Not with his hands. His hands were still moving, still relaxed, still confident. He caught it with the mask's will, manifesting a barrier of cartoon logic between the blade and himself. The lightsaber met that barrier and stopped, unable to process what it was meeting. Energy met absurdity, and absurdity won. Vex's eyes went wide. For the first time since becoming an Inquisitor, she'd encountered something the Force couldn't kill through direct application of violence. "Okay," Stanley said. "Here's the thing about being trained by ancient magic to use ancient magic. It works great until you meet someone who doesn't believe in magic. The mask doesn't care about your lightsaber or your Force training or your Imperial authority. It cares about being funny. And right now, the funniest thing happening is me walking out of this room with the information I came for." He released the lightsaber, and Vex flew backward, landing hard against the far wall. Not because the mask had thrown her, because she'd overextended when the blade she was pushing against suddenly stopped resisting, and physics had done the rest. "Tell your boss," Stanley said, moving toward the exit. that the green man from the other galaxy is going to be a problem. Tell him the mask doesn't follow Imperial doctrine, doesn't bow to the Emperor, and doesn't particularly care about the Force. Tell him..." Stanley paused at the door, his grin widening impossibly. "Tell him I'm planning to make his day significantly more interesting." He disappeared into the corridor before Vex could recover, leaving her on the floor, trying to reconcile what had just happened. In her entire life as an Inquisitor, she'd never encountered something that simply rejected the fundamental rules that Force training was built upon. She reached for her communicator, her hand shaking slightly. "Captain Nevin," she said, "we have a code chaos situation. Someone just infiltrated the records section, obtained classified information regarding Project Starkiller, and defeated me in direct combat through means that are not conventional." There was a pause on the other end. "An infiltrator? On a Star Destroyer? How is that?" "I'm sending you his last known location," Vex interrupted. "And Captain, I recommend you assume he's already escaped and is currently en route to cause maximum chaos in whatever direction amuses him most." Meanwhile, Stanley was indeed causing maximum chaos, though not through malice or planning. He'd simply walked into the wrong corridor, become briefly distracted by a door that looked interesting, and discovered the Star Destroyer's command center by accident. He'd also, somewhat accidentally, rerouted power to the detention block and was now standing in front of a cell containing a Jedi Knight, one of the last survivors of the Purge, imprisoned for 3 years, assuming Stanley's mask-assisted data scanning was correct. The Jedi looked up, stunned, seeing a green-faced man in a perfectly pressed suit standing outside her cell with a datapad glowing in one hand and a smile that suggested reality had just submitted its resignation. "Hi," Stanley said brightly. "I'm Stanley. I crashed into your galaxy about 6 hours ago, and I'm on what you might call a liberation rampage. Want to get out of here, or do you have other plans?" The Jedi stared at him. "What are you?" "Honestly," Stanley said, tapping the datapad and watching the cell door slide open, "I haven't figured that out yet, but whatever I am, it seems to be giving the Empire a really bad day, and that seems like a pretty good starting point for a partnership." The Jedi stood slowly, still uncertain whether she was hallucinating after years of imprisonment. But the opportunity was real. The open door was real. And the green-faced man with impossible confidence was definitely, absolutely real. "Let's go," the Jedi said, stepping out of her cell. "Excellent," Stanley said, already moving. "Because I'm fairly certain the alarms are about to sound, and this Star Destroyer is about to become significantly less enjoyable to be inside." As if on cue, the alarm system activated. Red lights bathed the corridors, and across the ship, soldiers began moving toward the source of the chaos, completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter.